Zimbabwe cash crisis
worse. Talking about Venezuela once again.
Systemic important banks. They removed the 1,000 thing called monetary awareness. Hey there, hope all is well. Back here today with some RT News updates. And as you can see from today's title, we're going to be talking about the idea that 61% of Americans have no idea how much they'll need to retire. And so I've actually been sitting on this article all weekend trying to figure out a way to really share my thoughts on this, even though I've really troubled at the idea that I've noticed a push towards the younger generation in particular on the importance of trying to estimate and guesstimate, more likely, a number needed in order to retire comfortably, without many people giving consideration to the idea of the times we're in and the fact that since the Great Recession of 08-09, how monetary policy and fiscal policy has really impacted people's ability to save and actually expect a return on their savings in just a conventional sense of being able to deposit money in your bank account and receive interest on that. Nevertheless, what's happening with the stock market and the pensions and all the conventional retirement vehicles that's experiencing major problems right now. So here we have an article here where they're looking to actually pinpoint some numbers and figures. And so you have people labeled financial experts giving people advice on what's ideal. And the model, in my opinion, is based upon prior information that is not really as relevant as today, given what's happening with our global economy. But before I dive into that, as always, if you notice, I have on a new shirt today. So I'm looking to bring us some new designs out this summer. So the shirt I have here is, you see George Washington shocked. So that shirt is called Shocked by Circumstance. And so if you guys are interested in supporting Rethinking the Dollar, feel free to click the link below and find out more information about this shirt. I have a variety of colors. And other than that, it's a good way just to support the show as well as to wear the message to get people to wonder, why is George Washington sitting there looking silly? And then you can go on to share your story as to why the circumstances are currently present would be a shock to him. Especially the most notable one is the idea that his face is on a dollar bill, and he himself experienced what it was like to have a currency inflated away with the continental currency, which was the very first currency of this country here that went belly up. But before I dive into today's article, as always, new to RTD, want to encourage you to click the subscribe button along with the notification tab to be informed of future updates as well as live streams. Also join me on Twitter, where I share posts throughout the day on various subject matters dealing with our monetary system as well as whatever's happening in the news that I can't get to via video. Make sure you click the button down below to be notified when things are posted. So today's article is from CNBC, and is actually a survey done by bankrate.com. And so they give a lot of statistics that are very interesting and very informative as to where we're at currently now and how the younger generation is really lost in regards to actually being able to pinpoint an ideal number. And even more so, those that are closer to retirement aren't really up to par themselves on having that ideal number needed to retire. And so I'm going to share my thoughts with you at the very end on how I believe that the idea of obtaining a number in this day and age is not really going to be something that's feasible. I think it's going to be more important to consider actually what is your actual tangible weight and assets outside of paper denominated things. And it has a lot to do with the idea that the actual number in of itself may not be something you want to shoot for, given the fact that if you understand monetary policy and monetary history, you understand how a number in and of itself is not really worth much if it doesn't purchase anything. An idea, to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, I actually have a couple notes here, of which I have various countries here, and they all tell an interesting story, and how I believe that this note here as well might be following the same pathway one day. And so I'll actually probably tonight have an RTD live talk stream where we'll talk about these notes here and how I believe this whole idea of coming up with an exact number might be fool's gold for the public. So let me dive into today's article. At the very end, if you're interested, feel free to click the link to read for yourself. So the very first thing here says, when asked how much they should have to put away in order to fund a comfortable retirement, a whopping 61% of Americans choose the answer, don't know. It says another 8% underestimate by a lot. They say they'll only need $250,000 or less, which is a fraction of the 1 million financial experts typically recommend. So I'm gonna stop right there. And so as I read through this, there's so many things that makes me want to stop and share my thoughts, because I really don't buy into the mainstream financial expert advice here. So I'm going to stop a lot during this news update just to give you my thoughts on it. So there we have the idea that they say they only need $250,000 or less. So that's the idea. That was just a number thrown out by those in the survey as to what they would need for retirement, not really knowing the age range. And then it says here, which is a fraction of the 1 million financial experts typically recommend. So here we have the idea that 1 million is what is recommended according to the financial experts. It says, but even with 15% of respondents who say they'll need between 250 and 1 million could be missing the mark as well, given that 1 million doesn't stretch as far as it used to. So the idea that $1 million, you think about what $1 million can do nowadays in comparison to what it could do 20, 30, 40 years ago, and it's not as much, especially with the fact that all the assets, you have the inflated stock market, you have the housing bubble, you got just the cost of living in general, you got car prices, student loan, everything that's needed to sustain your life in this day and age right now is overly inflated as far as it being overpriced for the majority of the population to actually be able to afford it. To nevertheless put a number in the form of $1 million as a number to shoot for people to set aside in an overinflated stock market without really considering the idea of any type of market correction or hiccup that can easily wipe half, if not more, of all that if it's invested in stocks solely away. So going on some more, it says on average, respondents estimate they'll need around $650,000, which could leave them broke in their old age. It says older generations are more likely to give a lower number. It says both boomers and those aged 73 and above say they'll only need $500,000 in the bank for retirement. So all this information here is based upon the responses given during these surveys. So here we have the idea that both baby boomers and age 73 and above say that they'll only need about $500,000 or $500,000 in the bank for retirement. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the idea that you can actually put your money in the bank and that $500,000 will actually lose purchasing power in regards to the actual interest earned minus the actual inflation rate, which is well above 2%. So you're automatically going to lose purchasing power with that money just sitting stagnant in a bank account, not to mention all the fees and things like that they may tax on top of that. But here you have the idea that if you kept $500,000 in the bank today, do you really actually believe that 10 years, 15, 20 years from now, when you need to retire or draw from it, that $500,000 is actually going to be $500,000 worth of purchasing power? And so everything, these numbers, all these numbers here that are given has no real sound monetary foundation underneath them in regards to the impact of inflation and the fact that if you are in the alternative media space, you know that there's some market situations brewing right now, as well as some global macroeconomic things that will impact the Federal Reserve note in and of itself. So it's good to say, in my opinion, that 10, 15, 20 years from now, the Federal Reserve note we know today will not be the same in years to come, just because all fiat currencies have a tendency of losing purchasing power, especially when monetary policy and fiscal policy collide. Says not only are Americans failing to understand how much they need to put away for their golden years, they aren't saving much either. Says a bank rate survey from March found that 20% of Americans don't save any of their annual income at all. So, hence the idea that because the cost of living goes up, you have a depreciating currency, and you have the idea that true real wages aren't keeping up with any of that. So you have the idea of a lack of disposable income when it comes to majority of Americans' finances. So here we have the idea of needing to use credit cards and to borrow money. So how can you save when you're not making enough to actually keep up with the cost of living in this country? Nevertheless, the idea that you still owe debt and you have all this surrounding you in regards to your expenditures for living. So there's no reason why people can't really save in an environment such as this. It says only 60% of survey respondents say that they save more than 15% of what they make, which is what experts generally recommend. It says a quarter of respondents report saving between 6 and 10% of their income, and 21% say they sock away 5% or less. So if you have a small part of the population only saving less than 10% roughly, that means that they are not able to actually probably function on a day-to-day basis. Nevertheless, to actually set aside money for savings for emergency's sake, nevertheless, to even think about setting aside money for their retirement. So there's going to be a discrepancy there anyway, just because there's not enough allocated to different types of accounts. According to retirement plan provider Fidelity Investments, a good rule of thumb is to have 10 times your final salary in savings if you want to retire at age 67. Fidelity also suggests a timeline to use in order to stay on track. And so basically by 30, have the equivalent of your salary saved. So if you're 30 years old, granted the fact you don't have student debts and all that stuff like that, which is good to say the majority of 30-year-olds / 40-year-olds are heavily still indebted if they pursue the higher learning route, which means a portion of their income goes towards paying those student loans if they're not deferred. Then you have the idea that most people aren't starting families now until later on because of all this debt. And so they're saying the recommendation would be have the equivalent of your salary saved by 30. By 40, have 3 times your salary saved. So just throw off some numbers there. So at 30 years old, you're entering your career, you're making $50,000. They're saying by this time now, you need to have around $50,000 in your bank account. And then 10 years later, or roughly, you're supposed to have $150,000 saved, whether it be in the bank or in your retirement. Then if you're 50, 6 times. And so all these numbers here are just basically recommendations from Fidelity Investments, which is a mainstream financial institution that profits heavily off giving advice like this. And at no point during this article here will you hear anything about the possibility of a market correction, or the other side where you have those financial gurus that are not mainstream, those that are more like the Peter Schiffs, the Jim Rogers, those that are saying that be careful, I'm getting out of stocks, I'm doing this because there's some type of correction coming. You'll never hear anything like that from a mainstream source like this, which is why I believe this is very dangerous information. Says you can also look at the 4% rule often used by early retirees. Says which states that if you can safely withdraw 4% a year from your retirement savings portfolio, you have enough in the bank to quit your job. So I'll let you decipher that one. So as I go down more, it talks more about ideal contributions. So just giving an idea of how to contribute to your retirement to get caught up to speed or whatnot. So the primary reason I'm pointing this article out just because over the last 48 hours, I really had a chance to really look over and reflect and get an idea of just the viewpoint given by this article here. And if you Google American savings not enough or whatever you choose to Google, it'll give you all types of articles like this, which basically is geared towards getting the younger population to pour their life savings, pour their earnings into the conventional markets as well as all these fidelity investment vehicles in the hopes of reassuring these people that they'll have a comfortable retirement. And what really concerns me is that in the alternative media space, my focus has been on just uncovering just more than one side of the coin, one side of the story. And so you have the mainstream, but then on the other side, you have what's happening around the world, which is well worth taking note of, because this same type of message here, I'm sure it was being promoted in other countries as well for the younger generation to help prop up the stock markets as well as the overall financial vehicles offered in those countries. So ideally, if you even look at just the same information that was shared perhaps in Venezuela. So here I have a 100 Bolivar note. And if people know the history behind this note is expired. So this is a number, 100. So you think in your mind that 100 Bolivars back in the day had a lot of purchasing power, but yet because of monetary policy and because of fiscal policy, when they collided, because of too much debt, it basically evaporated all the purchasing power in this note to where it's non-existent. Then we have what's going on currently in Argentina with the idea that this 100 peso note in of itself, back in the day when it traded on par with the dollar, was 1 and 1. So basically a $100 bill can get you 100 pesos approximately 20 years ago. And then over the last 20 years, because of monetary policy and fiscal policy colliding because of too much debt, countries aren't able to sustain the purchasing power of their national currency. So over time, these pieces of paper dwindle away because of inflation to where this note as of right now is worth approximately $4. When I received this note years ago from being in Argentina, it had a lot more purchasing power then. Then that brings me to this note here. Everyone knows what $100 can do today in comparison to what it could have done 10 years or say 20 years ago. It doesn't do as much. So you keep that in mind. Those are just 3 bills right there with the numbers 100 written on top of them. So in Argentina, if you have saved 100, 300,000 pesos, because of what's happening with monetary and fiscal policy colliding because of debt and just unsound practices, that 300,000 is nowhere near able to purchase what it would have purchased 20, 30 years ago. So my thing is, what would make you think that this note right here is going to be any different? The idea that $100, $300,000 will have the same amount of purchasing power 10 years from now, 20 years from now as it has today. Nevertheless, what it's had 10, 15, 20 years ago, just because fiat currencies are not designed to retain purchasing power. So the idea of looking for an ideal number to retire with is fool's gold, in my opinion. And I believe that in the days ahead, more people will come to the realization that it doesn't really matter what the number is, because the number can be as high as you want it to be. You can save $1 million, but if the million doesn't purchase much, then it did you no good to set it aside. So just want to share my thoughts on this whole idea of what that ideal number is and how 61% of Americans have no idea how much they'll need to retire. When in actuality, I believe it's not about how much. It's going to be more so about how much weight do you have in the form of tangible metals in your possession that are able to weather the storm regardless of whatever happens to the national paper currency. So other than that, I would love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. And also join me tonight for an RTD Live Talk, where I want to dive a little further into these 3 pieces of paper here in front of me and share my experiences with them, as well as get your take on how this whole idea of a number, it might not be what you think it might be today, as well as 10, 15, 20 years in the future. So other than that, look forward to bringing you more news updates, and I'll see you tonight, RTD Live Talk, 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.